Hello, my name is Richard Ingram and I'm going to do a presentation on the perspectives of psychology. So, Pennell says that psychology is the scientific study of behaviour, internal processes presumed to underline learning, memory, motivation, perception, and emotion. There are typically six psychology disciplines, as we can see here. Each approach has their strengths and weaknesses and brings something different to our understanding of human behaviour. Psychology began with William Wundt at the Institute for Experimental Psychology, and the first attempt to study perception and emotion scientifically, separating it from philosophy. For my presentation, I want to examine two perspectives: biopsychology, which seeks to underpin its research with clear biological methodologies, and psychoanalysis of Sigmund Freud, which offers valuable insight into all facets of the mind. When comparing these two disciplines, I want to consider them in the light of Descartes' mind-body problem. For Descartes, 1649, there is a dualism of the mind and the body. The mind sits within res cognitions, the thinking thing, summarised by his famous quote, "I think, therefore I am," and the rest of the body, including the brain, is res extensa. Biopsychology seeks to reduce this paradigm by viewing the mind as entirely within the brain and nervous system. Freud developed his own methodologies for studying the mind, particularly in uncovering the unconscious. So biopsychology is often described, the brain is often described as a machine, Henry 2013. Each advancement in our understanding has followed our ability to look and see more clearly. The biological approach explains human behavior, cognition, emotion, through internal biological mechanisms like genetics, brain function, hormones, neurotransmitters. It holds that behavior is a consequence for our genetic physiology. This means there is often little room for free will, and it can often be described as deterministic. So some key developments here is we have Pierre Flon, who directly challenged Fromm's goals phrenology through experiments with animals, concluding the brain wasn't necessarily built from personality traits we can measure from the skull. It was actually a unified, holistic whole, bringing the holistic theory of the brain, which kind of still stays around today. Camillo Golgi developed the Black reaction stain in 1873, and later Santiago Cabral used the same Golgi technique to disprove the reticular theory that Golgi, who was a holist view of the brain, to establish the neuron as an individual autonomous cell. Paul Broca and Carl Winnicke used clinical evidence from brain damaged patients to overturn Florin and establish the location function theory, showing specific regions handle distinct tasks for language production and comprehension. Kraepelin extended this into psychiatric classifications, separating dementia praecox from manic depressive insanity and laying the foundation for the DSM. So with biopsychology being a discipline of science, it is rooted in the scientific methodology. The biological approach holds that traits are inherited through the transmission of genes via DNA and evolve over generations to become better suited to their environment. Tinbergen, 1951, proposed that biological explanations of behaviour fall into four different categories. The physiological, how did the brain and body mechanically produce the behaviour, hormones, neurotransmitters and neuron pathways? This is particularly where biopsychology normally operates in. The ontogenetic, which how it develops in the individual over the course of their lifetime. Evolutionary, comparing with other apes potentially to see how it develops as a species. And functionally, why the particular brain structure exists at all and what adaptive purpose does it serve. To answer these questions, we have a look at Pennell, who outlines four core methods for examining brain damage. One being brain damage, two stimulating brain areas through an ECG, as we can see here, recording brain activity through that being an ECG and fMRI scanner, and correlating brain anatomy with behaviour using MRI imaging. As Calat 2019 cautions us, we should be careful not to overstate this as evidence tells us. Knowing that people, for example, have depression, show reduced activity in certain areas of the brain, does not tell us why they became depressed. Or, as we will see, correlation does not always equal causation. So a foundation of biopsychology was the neurodoctrine. Before biopsychology began to map out the brain, science had to establish what the brain was actually made of. Camille Golgi's black reaction stain made the individual neurostructure visible for the first time. He proposed that the brain and neurosystem works as a single reticular unit and the brain fires all together at once. Santiago Cabral went further to overturn the reticular theory and establish the neuron as a physiological autonomous unit, being the foundation of neuroscience. They recognized both of them with the shared Nobel Prize in 1906. Garcia Lorenza et al. Notes that this raised the critical question of how neural impulses are transmitted from one nerve cell to the other, being that Cabral's idea that neurons are individual units, as we can see here by the different types of neurons. To review what biopsychology assumes, the brain causes the mind, and to understand the basic units of the brain provides us the foundation for everything to follow. Nowhere is this clearer if we examine the post-mortem brain. As we will see, Broca and Winnicke's area, specific regions, directly affect our ability to comprehend and articulate speech. Paul Broca and Carl Winnicke, in their distinctive contribution to the localization of function theory, challenged the holistic view of the brain, that the whole brain worked together for every single task. In 1861, Broca presents the patient Tan, a patient who could understand language but could only utter the syllable Tan. The post-mortem autopsy revealed that lesions on his brain, the posterior inferior frontal gyrus on the left hemisphere, now known as Broca's area, the medical term for inability to communicate is called aphasia, and Sam Webster at the University of Swansea Medical School notes that injury to this area, although attributed to speech, can actually affect those who even speak with sign languages. According to Kronmanskia, Broca believed brain function was not entirely fixed. With time and therapy, individuals could improve. He wondered whether the right hemisphere was taking over the left hemisphere's function, anticipating our current understanding of neuroplasticity. In 1874, German neurologist Carl Winnicke described two patients who had difficulty understanding spoken language despite fluent circulation, so kind of different from Tan. Winnicke's area is located in the posterior portion, which will be further back here, in the left superior temporal gyrus, further back from Broca's area. Symptoms are common: patients who remain fluent in words but produce a lack of syntactic meaning. Crucially, Winnicke himself localized the discrete function of higher. He didn't believe there were locations for discrete higher function of language, a position that's still contemporary is debated part of neuroscience today. The next part is the classification of mental illness with Kraepelin. So the biological approach extended beyond the brain, mapping into classification of mental illness itself. Emil Kraepelin established a medical model of psychiatric diagnosis, separating dementia praecox, as we said before, from schizophrenia and manic depressive insanity. Though groundbreaking, Kraepelin's category system proved messier than anticipated. Disorders overlapped, and the individual behind the diagnosis risked being lost. August Hook, who was actually influenced by Freud's understanding of how hysteria developed, redefined this, insisting on understanding the whole person rather than merely labeling the disorder. As Martin 2007 argues, it planted the seed of what would become the DSM used by psychiatry today. What can we see from biopsychology is, even from the start, it had to incorporate the individual mind of its subject alongside its understanding of the brain. Without it, we would always fall short. It is precisely this question that we were going to look at Sigmund Freud and his understanding of psychodynamic psychology. Freud and his followers sought to explain the origin of human behaviour, and being driven of unconscious drives and hidden mental processes shape judgment, emotion, and behaviour. Freud is most commonly remembered as the founder of psychoanalysis, yet he began his career in neurology. He spent several years publishing work on neuroglia, spinal ganglia, and cerebral palsy, and in 1885 he was appointed lecturer of neurology at the University of Vienna, and his 1891 text on aphasia directly engaged with the discoveries of Broca and Winnicke, challenging the anatomical localization in favour of a broader neurogenic understanding of language. The pivotal shift came while studying under the great neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot. There, Freud encountered patients with hysteria. As Karenberg notes, Charcot insists insight into hysteria directly determined Freud's later preoccupations with psychogenetic mechanisms. Before Freud, such patients were regarded as malingerers. Freud proposed something meaningful, rooted in unconscious conflicts and hidden memories. The disorder was not in the brain, it was in the mind. Freud thought psychology essentially as physiology of the brain. The technology at the time was not capable of pursuing this ambitious aim, and until that moment, psychoanalysis would have to use more suitable clinical methods to understand its patients, being talk therapy. From this insight, Freud developed the topogenic model, dividing the mind into three realms: the unconscious, containing unacceptable ideas and feelings, and preconscious, containing acceptable ideas and feelings capable of becoming conscious. And then free association dream analysis became primarily methods for accessing what lay beneath the conscious awareness, culminating in Interpretation of Dreams 1900, which Freud considered his most important work. His subsequent publication extended out the ideas outwards. The Ego and the Id, 1923, replaced the topographic model with structural tripartite model of the ego, superego, and the id. Civilization's Discontent in the 1930s extended psychoanalytic thinking into broader theory of culture and human unhappiness. That sounds great. Freud also viewed behavior as being controlled from within the individual's unconscious motivation of childhood events, known as psychic determinism. This is obviously a parallel to the biological determinism of biopsychology, so they're kind of compatible theories in that sense. If we think about the strengths now of Freud, Freud's breakthrough was that he saw symptoms of hysteria as deriving from challenging emotion, memories hidden behind defenses, not just an altered state of consciousness. One of the most striking legacies of Freud comes from cognitive science. Hofstadter and Dennett in 1981 credit the idea that sophisticated information processes happening below conscious awareness is now a mainstream assumption in cognitive neuroscience. It was rather radical when Freud proposed it, but now it's something we kind of take to be very common when we look at MRI scanners. Mark Somm has demonstrated that unconscious processes, once considered untestable, are now regularly confirmed with fMRI and other neuroimaging, suggesting that psychoanalysis is gaining and finding more biological support. Weaknesses. Karl Popper in 1963 derived the most enduring methodological critique, his falsibility principle. This being, a patient who improves confirms the theory, a patient who resists confirms it equally. Resisting itself becomes evidence of deep unconscious conflict, yet Popper was careful to add that this was not a dismissal of Freud's importance, only his scientific status as it stood then. No case was seen than the case of Dora. Dora was an 18-year-old patient treated briefly in 1900 who eventually walked out after 3 months of seeing Freud. Freud concentrated on her turbulent relationship between Dora and her father and called her rejection of Frau K. Frau was the woman who Dora's father was having an affair with, whose husband was then given to Dora as kind of like a compensation, as an unconscious rejection of her own desire of her father, obviously citing the Oedipus complex that Freud is known for. However, according to Rose in 1986, she was actually discovering her own interest in her father's mistress. She had no interest in the husband, while at the same time clearly showing some challenges with suicidal ideations in letters, which her parents discovered. Freud sided with her father's affair, saying that it wasn't actually happening, and it was really an unconscious projection of her own inability to accept her heterosexuality. Freud consistently resists evidence of Dora's desire for Frau K. Rose 1986 argues that Dora's homosexual desire is used as an explanation of hysteria rather than recognizing as something completely separate. His own countertransference, which is a term he created for the effect a psychologist has on their understanding of a patient, projection, shaped what could and could not be heard. However, psychoanalysis, unlike a pure biological model, contains within itself a mechanism for integrating its own failure. This was part of the critique that Karl Popper had, but kind of flipped and saw it as actually a strength. The self-criticism capacity is actually what it's great at saying. It tries to integrate what it couldn't find by the term it came up with, countertransference. So we now have a word to describe that phenomenon. Contemporary psychoanalysis, McWilliams 2004, specifically identifies applications of psychoanalytic understanding to diverse clinical populations as a critical area of practice and a study. However, the therapist's own experience, cultural assumptions, gender, sexuality are not neutral. They shape what is heard and interpreted, and crucially, what could be missed. So when we are evaluating both, that would be McWilliams there, we are going to think about, personally, I got this from working in care. At the beginning of my presentation, I started with the idea of Descartes' separation of the mind and the brain. Biopsychology is answered by looking at the mind inside the brain. Psychoanalytic psychology demonstrated that the mind should be understood for its own sake. What could be argued is that it's not a failure of either perspective, but evidence of the nuances we need to understand human behaviour. So here's biopsychology. In 1977, psychiatrist George Engel proposed the biopsychosocial model of healthcare, arguing that illness, health cannot be understood through biology alone. Effective patient-centered care requires three dimensions simultaneously: the biological, the psychological, and the social. Engel was not dismissing biopsychology or psychodynamics. He was arguing that neither is sufficient alone, and that the patient sitting in front of you always needs three at once. In terms of the biological dimension, strength and limitants, biopsychology has given us extraordinary tools. Cajal's neurodoctrine, fMRI mapping and machinery of the brain, mapping the machinery of the brain, increasing its precision, Kreplin's classification in fact being the foundation of DSM, psychopharmacology, antidepressants, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers have transformed treatment of conditions that once left people without help. The practical case of biological intervention is also a matter of access and cost. SSRIs can be prescribed by GPs, are relatively inexpensive, and produce measurable results within weeks. Psychodynamic therapy is significantly less accessible and costs. Psychodynamic therapy is significantly less accessible and costs a lot more on a healthcare service with finite resources. However, Calat 2019 cautious that we should not overstate what biological evidence tells us. Once again, correlation does not equal causation. Popper and Eccles, who criticized biopsychology for thinking always that technology will just uncover more of the brain rather than try and deal with the individual in front of us. In terms of the psychological dimension, psychodynamics offered something biopsychology could not, a framework for understanding the individual with personal meaning. Freud's insight into symptoms carry meaning that past lives in the affect the present, and that what we cannot speak, we will enact, open a domain of human experience that brain scans have only to begin to reach today. Yet psychodynamics has its own limits of cultural blind spots, countertransference, as we saw with McWilliams in 2004. Now, the philosophical reflection, we're going to return to Descartes, who proposed that the mind and body are two distinct things. Griffith and Schultz, 2008, remind us that scientific concepts are tools for research, not gospel. Biopsychology and psychodynamic are not competing truths. They are complementary instruments, one mapping the machine and the other listening to it. The biopsychosocial model is a clinical wisdom that tells us that to which one we need to reach more first, meaning the brain is not the whole person, but neither is the mind. The person is always both, and always situated in a world that shapes them in ways neither biology nor psychology alone can account for. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation.